Well, I started working on my dissertation paper when I first saw patients in graduate school. And that was around 1971, 72, but I wasn't allowed to publish my paper until I actually got my dissertation approved. So it languished for a while and I kept working on it. I had discovered strategies of psychotherapy. And a few years later, out came the pragmatics of human communication, and I grabbed onto that. My fantasy was to write a paper toward an interactional description of depression that modeled toward an interactional description of schizophrenia. But I believe that the double bind theory applied more to depression than schizophrenia. I thought the schizophrenia paper was quite wrong-headed. I published the paper in 76. There wasn't an internet then. There wasn't current contents. I think was just starting. And so it was only by word of mouth that people had heard about my paper. I applied for a job at Berkeley and based on that work, and I eventually was hired. There was a bit of controversy. My work very much divided the clinical, non-clinical audience in ways I didn't expect. And then in January 1977, just a few months after arriving at Berkeley, I went down to MRI and gave a brown bag talk. I had asked John Weekland to come up to lecture in a linguistics class that I was teaching with Robin Lakoff. He said, why don't she and I come down to MRI and I give a talk and then he'll decide what he would do. He never did give us a talk that we wanted, but I did get invited to be the fifth member of the brief therapy team. I'm not sure why. I think I just arrived at a strategic moment. So what I did is I took the common observation that depression is a bummer. Depression is contagious. Depression wears out the people around them. But I wanted to take that negative view of the interpersonal behavior of depressed people and contextualize it, say that maybe the people around them are part of the problem. Similarly, I found that I was very frustrated working with depressed patients, but only if I pushed them. They had remarkable ability to push back. And it seemed to find all the little bit of resistance they had to influence did muster to say no. And I think I picked up the expression from pragmatics by that point, because I was already midway in writing this, help rejecting complainers. That's their problem. And maybe you're the problem if you offer them too much help and you get too enthusiastic about it. So the intended message was that other people interact with depressed people in ways that are demoralizing and depressing to everybody. Everybody gets them to a bummer. And one time over a couple of beers, I blurted out in a bar and someone recorded it. It's not what's in the depressed person's head, but what the depressed person's head is in, the interactional context. And that got to be my slogan. I had trouble figuring out where I'd said that, but someone said it in a bar. And so my message to therapists working with depressed people is look at yourself, pay attention to yourself. You're getting into trouble if you dispute the depressed client's negativity with phony reassurance. And they really have a way of turning smart therapists into pretty insensitive idiots because they get so desperate to reassure them that it can't be as bad as they say. And I also warn people that depression occurs in the context of lots of conflict, not just loss. So be careful about taking depressed person's sides, because when they feel a bit better about the other person, they may turn on you. And most importantly, don't get more committed to a plan of action than the depressed person is. Lay back, let them even just wallow in their ambivalence and suffering a bit, and then say, I really want to do what you want. So the other thing I noticed is not only is depression a bummer, it's an impairment. And depressed people aren't at their best. And you've got to allow them that. If you don't acknowledge that, again, you're getting in trouble. And you got to make sure that you don't personalize the depressed person's limitation as incompetence or deliberate, just to spite you. And I realized a lot of analysts in the 30s, like Nacht, who was writing about depression, really took it personal. They felt depressed people had a wicked countertransference. and they just wanted to frustrate the therapist, and they'd get satisfaction from that. And I think that Knock needed to go back into analysis himself. And the other thing is, we're dealing with marriages a lot of the time. Be careful about relying either on the depressed person or the spouse. Both have had a very rough time, and you need to appreciate that. The other thing is that sometimes depressed has a high correlation with marital distress, but sometimes the marital distress is considered the primary problem. Sometimes the depression is. The depressed person may agree with their spouse that their depression is ruining the marriage, or they both may agree that their marriage sucks. So you can't get too focused on the marital problems, and you take a cue. If they're over-focused, then you focus on the opposite. Similarly, if they're focusing on the depression, then you focus on the marital problems. Those are just general rules. They're hypotheses. And I even suggested that depressed persons adopt a limited sick role. They acknowledge they're not at their best. They develop a shared understanding that they agree that's not a good way to be, but they're doing what they can, and they can have to do what they can't do what they cannot. And I took Eleanor Roosevelt as my hero because I knew that she was plagued by deep depressions. And she said, "I'm doing the best I can at the moment. However, this is not my best moment." And then I would say, don't find benefit in depression, but find cover in it, and do the things that you might want to do when you won't be able to when your life is less disrupted. For instance, a woman has found out that her boyfriend was unfaithful. And right then she needed another man in her life, like a fish needed a bicycle. And I know that she wanted to have children, but she shouldn't rush out to the first man interested in having children with her. And so I asked her to look back on this transition where she didn't have a guy in her life, and how could she take advantage of that? Like, put some women in her life that could be good critics and judges of the quality of the men that she was getting involved with. Build her social support, basically. Also, you can't steal the depression from a person. You grab it, and they'll hold on to it. You have to pull their fingers off it to pull it away. And you avoid getting more agitated about that than your depressed patient. Sometimes you have to bear witness to their suffering, and that's hard to do because you think you're looking incompetent. Sometimes you can distract them a bit, but basically some people are pretty fixed on their depression, and you've got to hunker down with them. I had a preference for interviewing couples, family members separately, which I developed early. And I found that if you try to enact problems like structural therapists do, people are angry at each other and they're upset. And then when you want them to compromise at the end of the session, they're too stubborn and hurt to do that. And so what I would do is I'd hear from them separately, their accounts, spend 20 minutes with each, maybe, it's arbitrary. And then 10 minutes I'd come together, tell them what my version of what was going on, and give them an assignment. And sometimes I realized that the like for me wasn't evenly distributed in the family. And particularly husbands didn't like me talking to their wives about their problems, and they wouldn't even come in. So I would when a woman came in for therapy, I'd tell her I needed her husband's opinion. How could such a little bird of sweetness and light be seen so horrible? There must be another perspective. Could he set me right? And boy, they'd barge in. And then decide they wanted to get me out of life, and we'd compromise. And I felt that sometimes the only thing that warring couples would agree on is that I was being an asshole. And here's something I got from The Onion. They described their therapist as a jagoff whose prissy, ineffectual demeanor brought them closer than ever been for years. That would be an ideal outcome for me. I didn't want to win fans. I wanted to get patients out of my life and stumbling into the next problems rather than fighting with me. Here's a conversation I had with a tape that I used a lot Back then, it was a woman who had had her legs amputated because of an antibiotic-resistant infection developed while she was delivering a baby in the hospital. And so I said to her, why didn't you let it kill you? It almost killed me, and at times I wish it had killed me, sure. But when it came down to it, I decided I would not let it kill me any more than I let it kill me when my father molested me. I mean, I was mad as hell when my father molested me, but I wouldn't let it destroy me. Now, I had a bind. Was I going to dig back into the past, or was I going to try to pave over and keep moving? And so I decided, okay, but I wish we could bottle whatever you had to pass it on to others right now, like your husband. How do you think he's doing? She says he's not doing well. He's stoned all the time, and I need him to get more responsible so I can go back to work. Fine. That's a consultation. That was not therapy. She didn't need therapy. She already had therapy. She had drugs. All she needed was to get unstuck. And I also was sensitive to that marital problems may be biologically driven. And what really struck me is Frank Pittman coming clean about his work with Jane Fonda and Ted Turner, his spectacular celebrity couple. And they came in because Jane Fonda complained that she had really straightened Ted Turner out, and he no longer slept with waitresses and secretaries and flight attendants, and then he started doing it again. Frank suggested there was something phasic about it. And so he asked the question, do you ever get really dark, Ted? Do you ever really get depressed? He said, and Ted glared at him and said, you don't know how depressed I get. I sit in the chair, my father's rocking chair, and I suck on the gun that he sucked on and blew his brains out. That's how dark I get, Ted. So what? And so Ted recognized that medication was needed. Things went well for a while. And then he decided he liked his highs. He didn't like his medication. And he was even willing to give up Jane Fonda for that. Okay, the other thing is I recognize there's a seasonality. After MRI, I went to work in Michigan. And a significant portion of the patients there get seasonal affective disorders because there's basically no sun in Michigan from about maybe October until February. Not because the sun goes away, but because there's a cloud cover between the Great Lakes. And people get really gloomy, they gain weight they don't lose, but they also get rejection sensitivity. So a woman could be watching her TV program and something sad happens, her husband comes in and says, I really don't like what you cooked tonight. And she'll burst out in tears, influenced by what she was seeing on TV. She'll know that it's not about his criticism, although she didn't like being criticism, but she can't do much about it. And best they both can do is leave her alone. If she wants help, give it to her. If she's stumbling a bit, pick up, but don't try to cheer her up. And overall, you can review their history, and typically these couples have had a better spring than they had a fall, not just because they burned out their marital problems, because they burned out the seasonal affective disorder. In fact, some of the women actually get a bit hypomanic and have some of the greatest sex of the year in March and April, if you just ask them. Okay, so I have a biologically informed, I have a theoretical model. I wouldn't even call it a model. I have a framework. It was towards a model. And I think I do things differently than a lot of people who don't have such things. Furthermore, I learned you do not cure depression if it's really depression. Depression is a recurrent, chronic, episodic disorder, more like asthma than appendicitis. And if you think that your therapy regularly cures depression so that patients live happily ever after, you're either naive, delusional, or you're bullshitting me. Thank you.